everybody, and welcome to the Clarity Project podcast. I am your host, 𝗦𝗢𝗖𝗓𝗦. This episode is a little bit special because it is episode number 10. It is also a new year. It is already 2024. By the time I'm recording this, is already January 7? And it's been a few weeks since I uploaded the last one, but this 2024 is going to be huge. I have a lot of plans for 2024 in the near future. Should I say it? Probably should not say it. I'll just come it up as a surprise. But we're going to change things up with the podcast, and it's going to turn into a whole new different direction for this year, 2024. That being said, with this episode, we are going to do what we have always done for the previous 9 episodes, which is I'm going to get my notebook. See this? The magic notebook. One thing that I also realized is that this notebook is like really significant. If there's like a chance that if I lost this notebook, then I would imagine that the podcast will be like super different in terms of the format. Just because the Clarity Project podcast is known wherein I will get this notebook and I'm going to read the notes that I have in this notebook, and then I'm going to reflect on the notes afterwards. So for episode number 10, we are not going to pick something from these notes, but rather we'll just continue from where we left off from the previous episode. And from the previous episode, we've stopped by talking about awareness. And for this one, the very next passage goes like this. In academia, there's no difference between academia and the real world. In the real world, there is. And I do remember that I got this from a podcast somewhere. I don't remember who said it, which bums me out. But kind of makes sense also because this was in October 17, 2022. So that's almost like 2 years ago. So I don't really remember where this was from. I wish there's a note that indicates where it was from, but I do remember hearing this from a podcast also. So having heard that as a student, I remember like when I heard that, I was like, yeah, that does make sense because my professors are always like talking about, this should prepare you for the real world. They always tell us that, this is nothing compared to the real world, or that the real world is much scarier than this. The real world is much more serious than this. The real world is much more difficult than this, which brings me to question as a student that isn't school supposed to be like the real world? But then again, can you really simulate? Can you really emulate? Can you really train in school and think that it's going to translate 100% in the real world? So yeah, that got me thinking. I guess not. Because school, no matter how prepared you are in school, the real world is still going to be the real world. With that philosophy, I guess it just becomes this battle of which is closest to the real world or not. The schools should be focused on being close as to the real world as possible. And sometimes school make this mistake of either being so far from the real world, and that way when the students eventually come into the workforce, become part of the workforce, they are overwhelmed because it is nothing like that they have ever prepared for. In other words, they are simply underprepared. And also, you would imagine that the same is true conversely, which is that school could overprepare the students in a way that the students could not handle that kind of pressure and that kind of workload and that kind of system. So the students will always go back to this reality that there is, of course, a difference between school and the real world. And so as a student, when I was a student, I've always been more interested about learning the things that matters more in the real world rather than what matters more in school. Yes, there are similarities. There are some things that you could master in school that could translate well into the real world. However, there are very few things that does that, right? For example, there's no such thing as grades in the real world. You don't get bonus points, or you don't get like grades in increments, just like in school. For the little things that you do in the real world, sometimes they don't add up. Sometimes they're not going to translate into the things that you want to do or currently doing. Another thing is that as a student, I've never competed with any of my classmates simply because I find that idea to be absurd. It is absurd to me to be able to be enclosed in this kind of vacuum of thinking wherein I should be better than the top student in my classroom. That classroom to me did not exist. That classroom to me is an illusion of the rankings, because in the real world, you're not only going to be competing with the people in your classroom. Because as a student, I discovered early on that there's just no point in competing within the classroom, because that's just small thinking. If I only competed with the people inside my classroom, that would limit me to some degree, and that would also make me complacent, and that will also make me not dig a little bit deeper, not push myself, and have this false sense of security if I eventually do become someone who is quote best in class unquote. So for me, I'm much more interested in looking beyond a classroom, because the classroom is really an illusion. You're not only competing with the people inside of your classroom, you're not only competing with the people from the other sections, you're not only competing with the people in your school, in your whole school system, you're not only competing with the schools that are within the vicinity of the town or the city that you're in. No, you're competing not only also with the schools and students that are in your area, in your region, or your country. Now you're competing with everybody else. That's what globalism does. So it sucks a little bit, but that's the real world. To me, as a student, I was more focused on becoming the best version of myself and not really looking at any of my classmates, because if I put myself in a situation where I want to compete with them, that limits the things that I could improve on, because I can only improve based on the things that I am seeing firsthand. If I could train myself, and I did train myself to be able to look beyond the classroom, that's where things got going for me. And that's how I get to learn the things that my classmates are not learning. Because that's the truth. Not only am I competing with people that are the same age as me, I'm also competing with the previous graduates of last year and the previous graduates after that. And if I stay complacent, if I stay in my place and I don't improve, then the people who's going to graduate next year and the people who's going to graduate next year are also going to be the people that's after the job position that I want to be in. And so, if you're a student watching this, or if you know someone who's still in school, I think it's really important for you to understand this concept that school system and the people that you treat as your competitors in school is oftentimes just an illusion. If you think you're so good already just because you're quote top on class unquote, then you're mistakenly and you're sorely wrong, because the world has become bigger, and not only are you competing with the locals, you're competing with everybody else. And even the foreigners and even people from other countries are after the job that you want. So, what can I say about this? My route in terms of learning is very different from the traditional learner. I didn't engage myself to be an honor student. I don't want, it's not that I don't want it, but it's definitely not something that I pursued. Becoming an honor student is in and of itself, of course, in the name is an honor. Being an honor student tells me that you are someone who worked hard for it, because even if you are like really smart, if you really don't want to be an honor student, and it also depends on the kind of system that your school has, you're not going to be an honor student. And if you did become an honor student, even with minimal effort, then probably your school is just too easy for you. But I'm not going to get into those details, because that happens from a case to case basis. What I am interested in is saying to you that being an honor student in and of itself is a commitment of which that lets you change your priorities. What do I mean by that? If you want to be an honor student, definitely in terms of your learning, you're going to be more about the textbooks. You're going to be more about the extracurricular activities. It's going to be more about you understanding your school system and understanding what makes someone an honor student. To some school, it's more on extracurricular activities. To more school, it's a position in some kind of organization. to some school, it's more on academics. And what kind of academics we're talking about? Are we talking about more on the practical stuff? Are we talking about exams? Are we talking about oral exams? What are the things that matters when we look at the grading system? So it is in and of itself an art. Becoming an honor student is an art. If you really want to be an honor student, and if better, if you want to be not only an honor student, but if you want to be like top of your class or top of your batch, then it's going to be just a little harder for you to be able to do that. But people have done it before, and you could look at what they have done in the past. You could look at what they were able to sacrifice in order to get there. Becoming an honor student is actually pretty difficult. That's why I didn't want to do that. And also, it occurred to me that I weighed in the pros and cons about being an honor student. If I become an honor student, this is what's going to happen. And if I don't become an honor student, this is what's going to happen. It just is based on your personal preference on what you think is best for you, whether you are better off becoming an honor student or not. In most use cases, it is better for you to be an honor student. But for me, I wasn't interested in that because I was interested in learning skills. I was interested in gaining knowledge that probably my contemporaries, my classmates, are not learning because they're too busy reading our textbooks. My whole logic for that is that for the whole semester, we are reading about like one book, right? At least that's what happens in high school. What happens in high school is that for the whole semester and sometimes for the whole year, we are going to read just one book. And in most books and most subjects, we don't even get to finish that one book. My whole philosophy about that is that, okay, I'm still going to learn this book, but I'm also going to learn other books. By the end of the year, in theory, my classmates have only just learned about one book and they didn't even finish it. Whereas me, I have learned several books and they haven't even heard about these books. So that's the kind of philosophy that I went with as a college student. I wish I had that philosophy early on in high school, and so that I would imagine that I would know more. But it is something that I adopted only during the pandemic because I don't know if you already know the story. I've said the story numerous times, but there was a time where I quit filmmaking because and watching movies in general just because I was addicted to it, right? It's the first thing that I would do when I wake up, and it's the last thing that I would do before I go to bed. Having seen this strange addiction to cinema, I completely shut myself off from cinema and looked for an alternative to it, which is me discovering books. Nowadays, I don't read as much books, but I still read them. It is something that I picked off as in habit because I guess, looking back, so much of something is like really bad. And that is why I'm trying to strike a balance between the kinds of learning methods that I'm using. So I kind of am like really bored easily. So I have like this very different kind of learning methods in each day. And you just take a look at life, right? If you're observant, you don't need no books. It really helps if you have books because people have already experienced that, already thought about that. If you listen to podcasts, you would have realizations that you wouldn't have otherwise have had. But I find that if you're just observant enough, if you have the mental capacity to be able to discern the things that's happening around you, then you're heading in the right direction, and that lets you discover your own learning methods. That lets you discover what are the things that you want to prioritize, and that lets you discover what kind of student you actually want to be like. So yeah, I guess that's pretty much it, which is kind of weird because from the previous episode, we have been like reading like a couple of like paragraphs, but I found myself here that I've talked about just about this one paragraph. So what this says is that there's a criticism that when you're in school, they're insisting to you that this is what happens in the real world, or that this is not so close in what happens in the real world, when in reality, school is just so far from the real world. And that's just kind of what happened to me. I am much more concerned again on something that happens beyond the school. School to me is an illusion, and if you concern yourself with trying to be the best at just your classroom, it limits you from being the best version of yourself. You have to look within to get farther in the outside world. So that's kind of philosophy that I want to share with you guys on there. So, and yeah, I guess that's pretty much it. But before I go, I like to be able to tell you a little bit something, a little bit of an announcement between you and me on what's going to happen in the future of the Clarity Project podcast. So I've been thinking of getting guests for the podcast, and I've already messaged some people that if they want to be in the podcast or not. Right now, I'm in the process of getting a list and like talking to people on who I think would be a benefit to you guys of bringing them in the podcast and us being able to learn from them and having a conversation with them. And I guess that's kind of the announcement, right? I'm going to have guests for the future in this year in 2024. And also, I would imagine like the format would change. So, especially the language, I would imagine that it's probably in Taglish or in Filipino. But I'm still going to do like this solo podcast of wherein I'm going to read and reflect on my notes. But sure enough, for the future episode of the podcast where I'm just by myself, I'm still going to use this language because it's like really the core of what the podcast is and how I started years ago with Business Talks with Carl in Instagram Live, which is the very core of it is that I want to practice my English. And I know you might say that, Carl, you're already good, you don't need practice. Believe me, I'm so bad at it. And if you really like listen real closely, you'd know that there's like a lot of errors in my grammar and the way that I speak. So I'm still learning and I'm still trying to learn, and that's a process for myself. And I'm just really excited on how good I am in a matter in a span of time. Right? I don't know, like 3 years, maybe even 10 years. And if I'm lucky to be able to still be doing this in 10 years. So yeah, that's kind of the announcement. Again, I like to be able to thank you guys for sticking around. If you've been here since episode 0 all the way here, episode number 10, this new year, 2024, it's going to be a blast. I can't promise a lot, but just know that I'm going to be really serious about this. And I'm going to try and be better as a podcast host for you guys. And yeah, here's some more clarity. Bye bye.